and thank you very much for joining us on day 8 of the Black Country Business Festival. What a couple of weeks it's been. It's been a real busy time, and as you know, this is year 3 of the Business Festival, and every year we've picked up in numbers. We set this up originally primarily to raise the profile of the Black Country as a place to do business and show some of our brilliant best practice that was taking place. And we've got a cracking story to tell the country and the world, hopefully, about the things that we make and sell. But also an opportunity for us to share best practice and to work as partners right across the country. And our plans were for the first year to be a really local Black Country Business Festival, for year 2 for it to be more national feeling about it, although it would be held in Black Country. And for year 3, we want this to be international and play into the great networks that we have globally, as well as through the DIT and the trade stuff that we're doing. In March, we were going good guns, and we had to decide right at the last minute whether to postpone it from May, which we did, back to October. We wrote out to all the brilliant people who organising events as part of the festival, and we asked them to put it back. Most of them did. And even up to 2 weeks ago, we had to change physical events to ones that were either hybrid or online. And it is just testament to the incredible businesses across the region that we still had 96 events taking place over the 2-week period, which is unbelievable. So thank you all so much for doing that. And for those people who've been on more than 1 or 2 events over the last 2 weeks, thanks very much for your support. Hope you've learned absolutely loads about that. But because what a world we're in at the moment. All of us on this call earlier on were chatting about how crazy the world is, whether it's recession, whether it's preparing for Brexit, or the constant flow of new announcements around COVID-19. And, you know, the announcements are making doing business very, very difficult for all of us. And tonight we'd like to look at all of that. We've got some absolute brilliant speakers on the line tonight. They're the very cream of the intellectual crop across our 4 business organisations around the country. We've got from our own British Chamber of Commerce, the wonderful Hannah Essex. Thank you very much, Hannah. We'll come to you in a moment. We've got Ben Fletcher from Make UK. We've got Mike Cherry, who's National Chairman at FSB. And we've got Callum Biggins for Director of Campaigns from CBI. And I think it's testament really that both of the festival and of the way the organisations work together, that we all can share a platform like this. It's not about competition for members or our services or products, but absolutely about a united voice to make sure that the businesses across the country are supported and represented. So thank you all very much for that. We'll go straight into the questions. We will finish exactly at 6:30. I've been threatened by all of the speakers in their own ways that if we go beyond that they will never speak to any of us ever again. So I promise you we will wind up at about 6:28 to make sure everything's okay. So I'm going to go straight into the questions tonight, and it would seem wrong not to start with COVID-19. The first question really is the panel is a little bit looking back, you know, and not necessarily what's going to happen next one, but how effective so far have the government's support packages been for businesses, and how effective do you think the ones in place are going to be over the next couple of months? Hannah, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay, for that question.
Thanks, Corin, and thanks for inviting me along this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry not to be meeting you in person, but maybe we will next year. Yeah. It's hard. I mean, it's been such a year. So thinking back about how it all started, I remember I'm in the office today for the first time since mid-March, and I think one of the last days I was in here was when the Chancellor did his budget statement, and I remember us all being quite shocked and surprised in a positive way as to how far he had gone in terms of the support measures that he was announcing for business. And that's when the furlough scheme was first announced, but what I suppose we hadn't quite realised what was coming at that stage. And so I think initially the government really stepped up. They protected millions of jobs and put in place really quite speedy, particularly for Whitehall, some really incredible schemes, furlough, not least furlough, but also the C bills, and then later on the bounce back loans and other things, VAT postponement, rates relief, all things which in the midst of that awful time in March, April, when it felt like, you know, things were collapsing around us, it actually was genuinely life support for businesses and kept people in jobs and kept businesses alive. And it was a real game changer, and all credit to the government for what they did and for the pace at which they did it. And all of our organisations were working with them to get those schemes up and running, to iterate, to make sure they actually met the needs of business, and make sure that the support was there. I feel like over the summer, and as we've headed into the autumn, it's been a bit more of a reactive government and less of a proactive government. So we've been calling, and all of us have been saying all along, that what's your plan? So as we were seeing the restrictions starting to ease back in the early summer, what's the plan for releasing those restrictions, and how are you going to get the economy back up and running again? And it was all very last minute announcements, and you can now open on Tuesday or you can open on Saturday, and it didn't allow businesses the scope to plan. And then as we saw things start to unfortunately get worse again with the rate of infection spreading, starting in Leicester and then over the last few months, and the restrictions started to come in again. Again, we were saying, if you're bringing in these restrictions, what is your plan to support these businesses? Any restriction you bring in has to be aligned with a support package for the businesses that are affected. And let's not forget that even throughout all of this, there are still some businesses that have had no support whatsoever. So it feels like we haven't really had that clear plan. Now, there's been some progress. We've had the job support scheme, which will come in at the end of the furlough scheme, and now another support scheme for those businesses that are closed through no fault of their own. But we're yet to see whether or not that is sufficient. And our worry is that the longer this goes on, the greater the restrictions, the more widespread the restrictions, that what the government has got in place currently is simply not going to be enough to save jobs and to save livelihoods. So, and there's also a question around the restrictions they're bringing in, but that's maybe something we can come on to later. So I think it's a mixed bag. I think, we've all tried our best to make sure that there is great support out there for businesses. We have made improvements to the schemes. We have helped government realise they need to extend those schemes. But it still feels like we could do with a much more solid and concrete look ahead. This isn't something that's going to go away overnight. So what's the plan?
Thank you, Hannah. And Mike, coming on to you next. Mike, you must recognise this. I mean, a lot of your businesses are obviously the smaller businesses who are most at impact from some of these policy decisions. Is that how you see it as well?
They are, and I think, not going against anything at all that Hannah has said. She's absolutely right in all of us pulling together on commenting on how well the government support schemes have worked, on what they introduced, and particularly the speed with which I think we were all quite amazed the IT around the furlough worked for business from day one. I think that was commendable. It's just a pity we don't see that in other IT things that government tries to do half the time. But I think one of the problems that we faced at the very beginning, we've got the support there for employees. We had to fight very, very hard indeed for any support for the self-employed. And I think that remains part of the gap that is already there. And I think although the business rates grants were absolutely spot on for those businesses that got it, there have been too many gaps in supply chains and elsewhere that all of us continue to highlight and fight for. The business rates holidays only went to a very narrow defined group. And again, this is one of the biggest upfront costs that businesses face, even though we, and along with others, have been very successful in getting exemptions. There are still far, far too many businesses who are faced with the upfront costs of business rates, the upfront costs of national insurance, and for a long time now, all of us have been calling for reductions in these to enable businesses to retain more cash and to get through this crisis as best they can. And I think whilst we have the announcement now of the new job support scheme coming in from November through to April, in no way do we see that as being sufficient. And there needs to be much more support coming forward, because that is, again, only supporting those businesses that are either eligible for that money or indeed are told to shut. It ignores all of those in the supply chain. What do you do if you're in a business that is open but your supplier is shut? All of these big questions have yet to be answered, and we will continue to ask those questions of government to try and make sure that, as Hannah has rightly said, the support is there to get as many businesses through this as possible. And I think that's the core of what all of us are trying to do.
Thank you, Mike. And Callum, coming on to you. I mean, your members tend to be of a bigger size than the FSB necessarily, but have they fared any better from the government's packages of support?
Cheers, Corin, and thank you very much for having me along today. Obviously obliged to remind you in terms of the fact that the CBI represents 190,000 members, so we have businesses of all different shapes and sizes. So with that public service broadcast over, I think that fully agree with what Mike and what Hannah have said in terms of we're seeing tremendous agility, particularly from the Treasury, but in terms of what Mike said just there, in terms of the IT infrastructure holding up. I've never had a member compliment HMRC to me in the same way as what's happened over the past 6-7 months. So clearly something's going right on that side of Parliament. So on that side of Whitehall rather. So something for all of us to cling on to there in terms of some of the positives that we've seen. In terms of what we're seeing from our members, so agree with what Hannah and Mike have said there in terms of, if you cast your mind back, it was only 2 or 3 weeks ago that there was a winter economic plan, the 6th or so statement from the Chancellor, where he made quite a significant announcement. Clearly times moved on quite considerably since then. I mean, everyone's focused on the job support scheme, and rightly so, given the importance of employment. But when I'm speaking to, and the reaction from CBI members is that it's been quite mixed in terms of, if you don't have the demand there, if you're not able to reopen, if you're in live events or if you're in aviation in some respects, the job support scheme isn't going to be that useful to you. However, the VAT deferral is incredibly useful for a lot of people. The additional cash flow support, the extension in terms of loan repayments, all really welcome. Looking ahead, I think there's 3 key areas where we're looking for additional support really from government. So the first one is on communications, which doesn't actually cost anything if you think about it, but it is incredibly vital in terms of engineering that confidence that there needs to be in the economy, and at the moment can sympathise in terms of the difficulties that government's having to confront rapidly fast-moving situation. I think everyone on this call recognise the fact that there is room for improvement, shall we say, particularly in terms of the alignment between what's coming out of central government and local government off the back of what's happened this week. Second thing that the CBI is really looking for is the evidence. So what's the evidence case for the policy recommendations that are coming out from government, whether or not it's tier 1, 2 or 3? At the moment, we just don't know, and that's really important for confidence and for compliance as well. Something that I know lots of people are concerned about should they go into tier 3 later this week. And then the final one, which Mike and Hannah have already touched on, is in terms of ongoing support. So for those that are in tier 3, some of them have been shut down by decree, but lots of others have just effectively been shut down because of a collapse in their demand. And at the moment, there's no support for those sort of businesses. So that's where the CBI is focusing its attention as we head into the autumn and the winter.
Thank you. And Ben, over to you. Ben, clearly you look after manufacturers. On 2 counts, I guess. Have the packages been there for manufacturing in particularly, but also for you as an organisation? I know you run quite a successful apprenticeship scheme for your members as well. What sort of has the support been there for those apprentices and making sure that they've still got jobs to go to?
And they're 2 great questions, and thank you for the invitation, same as colleagues have said. I mean, it's tempting to disagree with everything I've heard already. It would be a bit more entertaining, but we actually do get on. So I'd like to be able to be back in a room with these colleagues at some point in future. I think that for manufacturing, there's been a real sense of a moving response. The job retention scheme was a huge success. And I think that this call is really evidence of why we are so keen to come to prestigious events like this, because without wanting to overplay and blow our own trumpet too much, the 4 organisations represented here took the Treasury, I think, on a huge journey. And I think the reason we were able to do so was because the kind of input that we got from companies who are on this call today, our members, people that we were speaking to at fora like this, was so powerful that translated into a really strong argument. And I think it's fair to say that all 4 of us would agree. Hannah alluded to it in her opening comments. Treasury was not in this mindset at the beginning of the process, and government wasn't in this mindset. And it was the voice of this that I think took them on the journey. I think as a result, manufacturers were, broadly speaking, very, very pleased with the original job retention scheme. Manufacturing wasn't asked to close, unlike some other sectors, but it had huge problems in continuing to operate. And there were bits of the sector that had a collapse in demand that is almost unprecedented, much, much greater in some areas than even the collapse in demand in 2008, 2009. And the speed of that collapse was just absolutely huge, from full order books to empty overnight. And the job retention scheme allowed firms breathing space, the ability to not make people redundant, to actually kind of take a breath and see what are we going to do next and how are we going to get through this. And in that initial period where no one knew how this was going to play out, that was vitally important. And I think the government deserve a huge amount of credit for that. I think where we're going next is much more uncertain. Callum's talked about that collapse in demand in certain sectors, and there are really very important jobs that we would argue are critical to the health of the economy. They're certainly not jobs that have died, but they're jobs in industries making planes, servicing planes, making vehicles. We need those jobs. We need them to help power the green revolution that's going to come. But there is absolutely no demand at the moment. So I think the jury's out to an extent on whether or not the government will respond, on whether or not that sort of moment of political movement, a really seismic shift in the political ground at the beginning, whether or not that's now been taken over by Treasury orthodoxy and economists who want to go back to the standard way of working. In regard to apprentices, I don't think we've yet done enough. I think some of the measures announced by government to put money in the pockets of companies that are taking on and keeping on apprentices, again, really, really critical. But as many of you on the call will know, we run an apprentice training centre in Aston. We have had an absolutely terrific response from firms who want to continue to place apprentices in that centre and train them. But the stark reality is that many, many firms simply have been unable to do so, not because they don't want to, but because the economics of doing so at the time, given their wider business pressures, are really, really challenging. And in manufacturing, despite COVID, despite Brexit, despite all the other issues, for many, many years, skills have been the #1 issue at the top of our members' list of priorities, because we have a skill shortage in manufacturing. And if we don't continue to bring apprentices into the industry, if we allow that to tail off for the next 2 or 3 years, a bad situation is going to be made even worse. And we've pushed government very hard on that. Our chief exec has sat down with the education secretary. We anticipate a meeting with the Chancellor in the near future. And I think that despite all the myriad challenges government has to face, not just in manufacturing, but across many other sectors, if we allow apprentice training to wither on the vine over the next 2 or 3 years, we'll pay a very, very heavy price for that.
Thank you very much for that. And we will make sure the Kickstart scheme is a success between us. I've absolutely no doubt about that. But you do wonder if the Kickstart money might have been a bit more successful, if it'd been more linked to the apprenticeship scheme to have a flow in, that might have been quite an interesting one. Hannah, just back to you quickly, if that's all right. The big debate at the moment is around about, is it possible to protect public health and keep the economy open? That's going to be the debate for the next 12 months, I imagine. Do you think it's possible to have that balance?
Well, I'm not a scientist or a medical professional or an epidemiologist or any of those things. I think it's really challenging. So if you think about it, just on health and economic terms, if you go to the 2 extremes, let nature run its course and let the virus run free, the health impact of that, people gone too soon, and the impact of long COVID, which we're only just starting to understand, will have extreme health impacts, but also economic impacts, because people will opt out of the economy themselves. People will not go out if they think that the virus is running free. And if you took that path, there wouldn't necessarily be the support in place to support businesses under those circumstances. So demand would fall, but there'd be no support there. If you take the other extreme, which is you lock everything down and wait for a vaccine, then you've got the health consequences of undiagnosed cancer, people, mental health challenges, people not being out and about and being healthy. But you've also got the dramatic economic consequences of businesses failing and jobs being lost. So there's no good way of doing this. So there has to be somehow balance. I think what we're, and I think a lot of people are frustrated by is and I think one of my colleagues alluded to this, is the evidence base. So take the 10 p.m. curfew, for example. I mean, I'm no expert, but when I see the crowds of people swarming on the streets and hearing of people going back to house parties and seeing people crowding onto tubes and buses, it seems like the unintended consequences of that policy are having more of a negative impact than the policy itself. So I think what we want to see is an evidence-based approach, that if by closing parts of the economy, you can, in the long term, save more people, more businesses, more jobs, and you adequately support those businesses that are forced to close or who have the knock-on effect of closures, the supply chain and people suffering the lack of footfall and demand, then maybe there's a way through this. But at the moment, it feels like there's a underlying lack of evidence to support the restrictions that are being put in place, and the support is not commensurate with the challenge. So the new job support scheme being focused on those businesses that are closed, as Callum said, that doesn't help. You know, if you're an Oxfordshire tourist attraction, Oxford city centre tourist attraction, and all of the, I take a Black Country example. If you're in the Black Country and you're a tourist attraction, all of the pubs and the restaurants around you are closed. People are worried about the rising numbers of infections, and you technically are open. You're not going to have the same people coming to see you as you were before, but there's no support for you. So it feels like at the moment that the balance has not been struck either on the way that the restrictions are being imposed or the support that's in place.
Thank you. And Mike, to you, did you think you can find that balance? And I also imagine a lot of your members that have been impacted by those curfew rules, that people are a little bit confused about whether there's any evidence that they're being successful or not.
Yeah, I think let's all face it, safety has to be at the forefront of our minds. But I think, as you rightly say, when we particularly look at the hospitality sector, having a curfew that does not now seem in any way based on the evidence, and as Hannah's so rightly pointed out, you know, all these people being turfed out at 10 o'clock and then having a street party or a cricket party or whatever it may be, just doesn't seem right. And it is businesses that are suffering accordingly when actually it's not the business's fault. I think one of the things that we were really, really pleased to see was the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. That was an almost off-the-cuff one that has worked. And then, of course, we saw the further lockdowns as they came in, whether it was Leicester, whether it was Aberdeen, whether it was the North West or whatever. And it comes back to this whole point about the fundamentals around the Eat Out to Help Out. It's trying to restore confidence. And I think you really are, with the messaging that's coming out with the here today, gone tomorrow idea, that you are losing the confidence that people had to be able to support small businesses. And so whether it's hospitality, whether it's retail, whether it's other sectors, small businesses really are struggling at the moment, and the support is not going to be there as things are at the moment, unless you are actually either shut down or eligible for getting that job security and everything else that goes along with that. So there has to be more to come. Businesses are really, really going to struggle. And I think for the smaller businesses in particular, they had at the outset thought that, well, this is only going to be for about 3 months. And then the Chancellor announced, well, we're going to support you through to the autumn. And I think the uncertainty that small businesses in particular, and the mental health and all the other issues that go alongside that, both for the owner and indeed for their employees, is a challenge that we all must face head on, because it is going to be a very, very difficult 6 months. You're seeing the reports now that this could go on for 12 months before the population gets the vaccine that we're all hopeful will come out of the huge efforts that are going on behind the scenes. And therefore, we have to prepare businesses and support businesses as much as we possibly can in all the ways possible to get them through this period. And that means that we have to have confidence in continuing to support the smallest businesses who were just seeing that glimmer of hope coming back in. And to a large extent, a lot of that has now gone away again. And you're not seeing the footfalls, you're seeing the curfew, you're not seeing the evidence. So the messaging over the next few months, both from business organisations being able to help government with that, and indeed making sure that we have an effective test and trace mechanism in place to help that confidence, is absolutely critical.
Thank you. And Callum, to you, you spend a lot of time representing your members and talking to your members about these needs. Do they have confidence that that balance between public health and the economy are being met at the moment?
Bluntly, I don't think they do, if I'm being perfectly honest. I mean, it was as Hannah was saying, like, there's been lots of speculation in the press in terms of who the cabinet doves are, who the cabinet hawks are, and then the prime minister's somewhere in the middle and all the rest of it. But just to give you a live example, if you think about it, leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, called for a circuit breaker, a nationwide circuit breaker for England yesterday. What's not clear for businesses, even though there's lots of speculation in the SAGE documents as well, is what's the purpose behind having a circuit breaker? Is it because we think the R is too high, so we want to get it down? Is it because, as Mike was saying there, in terms of test and trace is in a little bit of difficulty, so let's have a reset period so that we can get it up and running in an effective sort of way? Is it in terms of going back to what we said at the start, in terms of protecting the NHS? People don't know. Similarly, in terms of the length of time, the review mechanisms, what's your exit strategy? These are the questions that lots of businesses are asking, because as Mike said, initially it was 3 months, then it was 6 months, and it was 8 months just in terms of the JRS. Now businesses are thinking in terms of, okay, if I'm looking at my employment at the moment, where do I think my demand is going to come back? And that's impacting whether or not they're going to use the job support scheme, whether or not they're going to use the job retention bonus, et cetera, et cetera. That's the calculations that HR directors, finance directors are making all the time. And unfortunately, as you can see through some of the job losses that come out just this week, particularly say, for instance, Green King, you can see that those calculations are falling on the wrong side for all of us. And it's really upsetting to see.
Thank you. And Ben, to you, the margins in manufacturing aren't huge, are they? And a lot of your members will be asked to make quite a lot of changes to protect their staff. And for policy changes, it seems to change quite a lot. And I imagine they must find that very frustrating at the moment. So that's not a leading question at all.
No, I think it's a very fair question. And I mean, some of the comments that I've had from members about this are unrepeatable, even in front of a very intelligent and sober audience that we have tonight. I think that there is a huge challenge in manufacturing, in the same way that there is in some other industries. We can't predominantly work from home. Manufacturing, by its very nature, it requires people to work in a setting, often in very close proximity with other people. Handling things together, moving things together, and often working in quite challenging environments. And some fantastic firms have led the way, I think, and we were very proud, along with some of our colleagues represented here, to feed into the government guidance on how to deliver COVID-safe workplaces, because firms were ahead of the curve. You know, they were open all the way through, and in order to keep their workforces safe, because people care about their workforces, they had defined the right way to work safely that was then able to be rolled out across the country. But it comes at a huge cost. It comes at a significant impact on productivity. And I think, certainly talking to our member companies at the moment, I'd echo a number of the comments made. There is a real nervousness about the lack of strategy. What is the way in which we get out of this? Because firms, you know, can continue to operate like this for a long time, but they can't continue to operate this and invest in new kit. They can't afford to operate in this way and give their staff a pay rise to reward them for the incredible efforts that they've made at the end of this year. It has a huge cost. It has a huge bearing. And I think the nervousness at the moment is, you know, we're not following the New Zealand model. We haven't shut our borders. We haven't shut the country down. We haven't eradicated COVID. That's probably impossible for the UK. But if we're not doing that, are we following the Southeast Asian model? Are we doing many more tests? Are we having tests to go into work, to get on the public transport system? And I think there is a bit of a mixture, I think, between a bit of humility in looking at some other countries and seeing what they've done well. And we're not very good at that. And we haven't had a great evidence of that. And actually also a little bit of self-confidence, because we can learn from other people. And even though some of those systems look very, very different and very challenging, there's absolutely no reason British manufacturers can be part of that solution. We can create the testing equipment, we can create the kits, we can roll them out in big numbers. We could have a fundamentally different way of doing this. And I think talking to people who have experience of SARS, you know, it required that degree of humility to learn and self-confidence to do something differently. And I think if we do have some sort of circuit breaker or lockdown, absolutely critical that we use that time to do things differently and have a different approach. Because if we repeat the mistakes of the last few months, it will be economically disastrous. We will not get through this twice.
Thank you very much. And I'll move the conversation on now, if that's okay. Thank you all very much for that. I wanted to just touch now on the levelling up agenda. I mean, you've all got national roles with national organisations, but the Black Country is a very good example of somewhere that desperately feels the need for the levelling up agenda to work. You know, we have high areas of deprivation, quite low skill levels sometimes, but at the same time, our businesses generate a huge amount of money for the national GDP. the question really is about the levelling up agenda. It's quite easy to be cynical about this, and I wondered, how serious do you think that the government are about levelling up the national economy? And Hannah, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Thanks, Corin. And we were talking about this at BCC here earlier today. Every single one of your colleagues, Corin, around the chamber network in 53 different locations across the United Kingdom will tell us that they want to be part of the levelling up agenda. So it's often talked about as being about the North, sometimes the Midlands are included in there. It's always tied to the sort of the politics of the Red Wall and so on. But actually every area that a chamber represents will tell you that there's a pocket there or pockets or areas there which need levelling up. So I think, firstly, it needs to not be a North-South thing. It needs to be kind of, what do we want for this whole country, and how and where should we focus our energies and efforts in order to create a better economic and social future for those people. It was, you know, I'm not entirely sure what the government means when they say levelling up. So it was a big buzzword during the election campaign. Politically, I would say the government will probably look at it and think that it worked, and then it helped them to break through in some areas where they'd struggled to secure votes before. But if they haven't yet defined what it is, how they are going to tackle it. And I think, you know, COVID obviously hasn't helped, because all of us have plans for this year that have gone out the window, and governments among them. So I'm not entirely sure what it is. I believe that successive governments have wanted to rebalance things, have wanted to get to improve the economic and social outlooks for people in different parts of the country. And certainly when you talk to the government, they sound very serious about it, but I don't know what it is. And I think that's the challenge. So what, and probably what the answer is the answer is different in every different part of the country you go to. So in some places, it's about making sure the infrastructure is in place so that they have better opportunities to go and work and connect in different places. For some people, it's about skills and the quality of education and the skills sector. For other places, there are sort of deep-seated social issues that need to be tackled. It isn't a one-size-fits-all. It isn't just take this and do this and it'll all be fine. It's a big, serious challenge. Ideally, I think the government would pull together a coalition of different people from business, from the social sector, from civil society, from cross politics, to really tackle this issue head on and figure out a way of improving the lives of everybody in the country. But I think COVID has obviously delayed any kind of discussion around that. I think they intended to be serious about it. I think we're yet to see what that plan actually looks like.
Thank you. And Mike, to you, I think sometimes, Hannah's right, sometimes we think geographically about the levelling up agenda, but I guess for a lot of your members, they might have slipped, there might be gaps actually in the existing support that exists out there, and levelling up would actually mean that everyone gets access to the same support that everybody else does, I guess. Is that right, Mike?
Well, I think there's some overriders here that would benefit all businesses. And I think this comes down to basically three probable basics. First and foremost, around all of this has to be infrastructure. And I think if there's one thing that COVID has shone a light on, it's how bad some of the infrastructure around broadband and mobile connectivity is. If more people are going to be working from home and businesses are going to be wanting to work more from home and in rural areas. So I think, I was dismayed when I heard the comments that actually we're not going to do this by 25. If BT had their way, it would be by 33. I mean, that is just unacceptable. Government has to get behind this and recognise that it's the fourth utility. COVID has shone a light on this, and goodness knows how businesses in so many areas of the country, not just rural, who are so badly affected, but also in some of our towns and cities as well, where it's just not fit for purpose yet. So I think a lot more effort and understanding there. I think also when you look at the Midlands Way and HS3, if we are to have that connectivity, it's got to reflect what the needs are in some of the areas around the East and West Midlands. It's got to reflect what's there between North East and North West. And I think that's an area that government talks a lot about, but we seem to have gone cold on that. And then I think fundamentally, coming back to a point that Ben's made in the discussion around apprenticeships, we are incredibly bad at having a consistent offering for vocational training in this country. One of the things that would really, really benefit the UK, surely, is to have good vocational treated as being absolutely equal to academic. and getting the skills base right for what we need for our future, whether that be in tech, whether it be in manufacturing, whether it still be in basics, quite frankly, because there are individuals who are only able to do those basics, and there are still jobs there that require that. And then, of course, looking at how AI, robotics, and everything else is going to be of benefit for the future. So I can remember having this discussion in the West Midlands probably 15 years ago. And it needs to be based on the need of business. What is the need for our future? And somebody needs to pull that together and have a consistent offering for our young people, and indeed for those who are unfortunately going to lose their jobs during this crisis, to be able to upskill themselves and be fit for their future as well as everyone else's. And then, of course, tax simplification. What does that mean? As Ben knows only too well, there are certain sectors around manufacturing and elsewhere that are disproportionately affected by business rates. It's no longer fit for purpose. And quite frankly, we have to address that as a fundamental upfront cost that is doing so much damage to a lot of our manufacturing base and elsewhere, to help them reduce their costs and be able to compete and invest for the future.
Yeah, and I think we'd all shout amen to that on the skills issues, Mike. And hopefully the new FE white paper will start to put businesses at the start of the design process for the skills industry, rather than being people who get sold to at the end of the process. I think that would be a big one. Callum, to you, I mean, I think I'm with Hannah. I'm not really sure what the levelling up agenda really means for the government. I hope it's not just a brand that they can announce any investment into areas in the country. That would be awful. But how does the CBI feel about this?
In a similar sort of space to Hannah and Mike, if I'm being perfectly honest, in terms of the fact that everyone can buy into levelling up. And certainly when we were able to do the in-person roundtables at the start of the year, you go to like Norwich, or you go down to Bristol, for instance, or even further into the southwest, they were incredibly concerned about the fact that they were going to get left behind by the levelling up agenda, because, as Hannah said, there's a political backdrop to it, which is clearly the red wall, the blue wall, depending on what your particular preference is. In terms of what businesses are seeing, in terms of the conversations that I have, I think they're deeply concerned about the fact that the government hasn't come forward with the goods just yet. If you think about it, in terms of, we've only had 7 local industrial strategies published, despite the fact that industrial strategy has been above the door of the business department for a number of years now. You keep on seeing a chopping of changing in terms of the ministers that are in the housing ministry at the moment. So obviously Simon Clarke left earlier this year. That again has delayed the devolution white paper. And alongside that, what you're seeing is the fact that, okay, we've got quite substantial devolution in London, but devolution in an English context outside of London is still finding its feet. And that's something that a lot of members are concerned about, particularly in terms of how do we ensure that everything's streamlined rather than getting involved in local politics. That's a really big concern. And then secondly, as well, is in terms of, if I'm not in a combined mayoral authority area, does that mean I'm getting left behind? And that's certainly something that, say, for instance, colleagues in the East Midlands are looking across to Birmingham with like green-eyed envy, because you can see the work that Andy Street is doing. And Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, they're not able to get their act together, and businesses there are incredibly concerned about the impact that could have for them.
Thank you. Ben next. Callum makes a very good point here. When we're looking about levelling up, from a societal point of view, you would hope that to address those inconsistencies, in wage levels and communities, more money would be given to sort of local authorities and combined authorities to deal with society. From a business level, you'd think that the industrial strategies could have been a great way of focusing money in to help level the economy up. Is that how you see it for manufacturers?
Yeah, I mean, I quickly just want to attempt to curry favour with this audience and jump on something that was just mentioned, that despite the North London accent, I'm a Leicester City fan. So I'm particularly pleased that for me, levelling up means that Leicester, Wolves, Villa and the Baggies are back in the Premier League. But I'm particularly pleased that that we're on top of all of you, which is my attempt to lose my audience, just as I've attempted to curry favour with them. And I'm getting that in now before we play Villa on Sunday, because given the form Villa are in, that may come to an end quite quickly. The critical thing, I think, in terms of industrial strategy and the entire levelling up agenda from our perspective at Make UK, is that if you look at many of the parts of the country where levelling up is expected to be a particular focus, there are areas where manufacturing is a disproportionately large part of the economy, where a very large number of people work in that sector, And going to your point about industrial strategies, that benefit is not really understood. And actually, there's a common thread that runs through everything that Mike and Callum and Hannah have all said. From our perspective, if you really want to get the value out of levelling up, you need to really understand the locality, to understand your local economy and be able to do something about it. And central government can provide the spine, the kind of things that several people have talked about, digital quality broadband, really strong capabilities everywhere, rolling out 5G so that even if you're not close to a fibre in the ground, you can actually access that. It's not just about tech businesses that need that. Everyone's going to need that to drive their systems of the future, to be able to drive their sales platforms, to make sure that they can benefit from that. So you need that central government infrastructure and architecture to make it happen. But you do need more power devolved to local authorities, more local authorities also to be confident and ambitious to use it. There's often this point about pushing it out. There also has to be a real sense locally that people want to grip it and do something with it. And that's also the push and pull, I think, that's really important here. And I think that the thing that I think will be the single biggest test of this is, I think there was a genuine desire in central government to do this. After the election, I'm very conscious that I was actually in Yorkshire and the Humber on the day of the election at a member meeting, and several people said to me at that meeting, I'm the chief exec of a business, and I'm not voting Conservative for the first time in my life at this election. I'm very cross about X, I'm very cross about Y, and I'm not voting Conservative. But almost everyone I've spoken to on my workforce is voting Conservative and is voting Conservative for the first time. And I think the politics of this are very real. And I think that government understood that, and government came into power with a real sense that they had to do something, and they had to show that they were going to deliver. The real challenge will be tying this back to our previous conversation. There is a lot less money now. A lot of the money that was going to be identified for this has been spent. Government has already driven borrowing to record levels outside of wartime. So the real challenge will be, yes, we need local powers, we need ambitious local authorities. Yes, we need a spine upon which localities can build their own industrial strategies and have a clear and coherent plan with confidence that they go forward. But government now needs to decide in an incredibly challenging fiscal environment whether it's going to invest the money in this. We very much hope they do. We think it's an absolute priority, but it's going to be a very difficult political battle. And that's why voices like yours and us, if we can ever amplify them, are going to be increasingly important over the next few months.
Thank you very much. And just sort of sticking with that point slightly, and I'll be over to Hannah next. We have had some very expensive interventions to support businesses through the last 6 months. That's not going to change for the next 12 months. We're also talking about additional investment into areas to do that, to complete this idea of what a levelling up agenda is. One of our listeners tonight has suggested that rather than taxing businesses who are already paying taxes, maybe we should think about recovering some money from tax havens and from those big tech companies that don't pay enough tax at the moment. Hannah, just to you slightly, how do we start to pay some of that debt off without putting the burden completely on normal tax-paying businesses?
It's a great question, and it's one that is being discussed. I think there's two things going on at the moment. There are some businesses who are doing okay. They're still functioning and haven't been too adversely affected by COVID. Some businesses have actually benefited in various ways because they've been providing a product or a service which has really helped out into these current sectors, or they've managed to pivot and introduce e-commerce or things that have made sure that their business has survived. So I think there needs to be a twin track. There's those businesses, and they need to be incentivized to invest and to grow. And then there are those businesses that still need live support. They still need seeing through this difficult winter and beyond, and they need some additional support to get them through there. But if you can start now getting these other businesses that are doing okay to invest and grow, increasing the annual investment allowance, incentivizing innovation, those people who've come up with furloughed and have come up with a great idea on their kitchen table, helping them to get that up and running and to get that growing. That needs to happen now, as while the crisis is still ongoing, because we need those businesses to come in, start employing people, start giving, putting money back into the tax system. But then at some point, when we get through all of this, there will need to be some payback. I think the Second World War took 100 years or something to, to pay back. We're probably still paying it back now. So there's going to be a long game. It's not something that can happen quickly. We're having to spend a lot of money to keep people in jobs, to keep businesses afloat. There has to be a clear long-term plan for getting back onto a better footing, and not just a sudden emergency dramatic raise of taxes, because this recovery is going to take a long time. If you combine that with whatever happens in January, and there's a lot of uncertainty around that, a lot of businesses have been holding back on that investment for a long time. Even before COVID came along, they've been holding back on the growth that they want to see. So let's help them to invest. Let's help them to think about growing if they're in that position. If they're not in that position, we need to hold their hand and keep them going through this difficult time, and then find a way over time of all contributing back into the coffers that have helped us all through this difficult time.
Thank you. And Mike, the last thing that your members need is higher tax bills, either from business rates, VAT, or national insurance. I guess you recognise what Hannah's saying.
Absolutely agree with where Hannah's coming from on this one, and I think all of us do. I think the important thing is, what is the government looking at for coming out of this? What is the journey for growth and for investment and for incentivising those businesses? And I think some of these C-bills and bounce back loans almost need to be converted into being able to be paid back rather like student loans, which is something FSB have put forward, so that those payments come out of profits, which doesn't hold the business back from being able to invest further in its future when it sees the opportunities that are there. And I think the government needs to be very, very focused on that, and not increase taxation on business. Business needs almost reduced taxes, or certainly more incentivisation and refocusing, as I said a short while back, on the overall tax burden of business taxation. That needs to be rebalanced so that you can help businesses that are able to invest, as Hannah has absolutely said, but not hold back the business economy that is going to be so critical, and small businesses are going to be absolutely at the heart of this recovery. As we've seen, many small businesses have innovated, moved their business model into supporting other areas, whether it be around PPE or indeed changing direction altogether. I think that's to be commended, but many more businesses need that support for looking at their future, looking at growth and investment, without being held back by loans that they are just struggling to pay back when it's not profitable for them to do so.
Thank you. And Callum, to you, government people often look towards businesses, don't they, as a cash cow for these types of things, without actually realising the huge contribution that businesses already make to national finances. I guess that's something you recognise.
Absolutely. I think that, as Hannah said, so I think we're looking at over 2 trillion in terms of our debt or thereabouts, which is an incredible amount of money in anyone's book. If you try and write down the amount of zeros, you might have to go onto more than one line. I suppose fundamentally, though, if you think about it, is that you've got that debt, and the question at the moment is, where does that debt sit? Does it sit on private bank accounts, so in terms of your businesses? Does it sit on individuals, or does it sit on the state's books? I think at the moment, even if you look at what happened with the IFS yesterday or early in the week, IMF today, clear consensus at the moment within the economics community that because interest rates are so low, it makes sense at the moment for it to sit on the public balance sheet. I don't think that any of us on this call will disagree with that for the moment. That's not to say that we don't have to have a strategy for paying it back over the longer term. And as Hannah said, whether or not you adopt some sort of war-like bond to be able to do so, certainly something that I know a lot of people in the economics community are thinking about. But alongside thinking about how much money we can raise through taxes, I think we also have to think about what's the tax system actually for? And for me, it comes back to what type of economy do we want to have? And how can we use the tax system to incentivize that sort of economic activity? Because at the moment, it's quite piecemeal. And obviously, one of the previous chancellors was notorious for this in terms of, despite that he had a black hole in his budget. So I tell you what, I'll just do this, this or this. And that created a huge amount of uncertainty, damaged the UK's international reputation. So we need to think much more holistic about what's the sort of economy that we want to have, and then how do we use the tax system to ensure we deliver that vision.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much. And Ben, higher taxes in an industry where you have to pass those expenses and higher costs on somewhere into the supply chain, don't you? Just slows trade down even more, doesn't it, I guess?
Well, and I think, you know, several people have talked about supply chains. Supply chains are often domestic, but increasingly are international. And if Britain becomes an expensive place to do business, people will cut us out of that integrated supply chain very, very quickly. I think from a manufacturing perspective, and I'm not going to go on too long because the key points have been made and have been made very, very well already. I think the point about international reputation is one that I would really focus on in this context. I think the need for a strategic response is key. I think, as well as some of the mistakes of past chancellors of the Exchequer, one of the things that already a couple of members have started to talk to us about is hearing the language about balancing the books and actually doing that too quickly. If we do so, then inevitably we're going to be, I think, moving to a tax regime that isn't going to help us stimulate growth. And I think in manufacturing, as well as the integrated supply chains, there is also an enormous amount of foreign interest and foreign investment in manufacturing. Many firms are either firms that are owned by overseas parents or British firms that own firms themselves overseas or part of conglomerates. It's a part of the international world of manufacturing. If Britain is seen as an expensive place to do business, if people think that over the next 20 years they're not going to be able to make a good profit, they're going to move away from the UK. And I think it's really important that in facing up to an incredibly large bill, that we have a long-term strategic view and we don't make mistakes that encourage people to take their businesses and put them in other countries. That would be a shocking conclusion to a crisis where actually manufacturing has stepped up in the national interest, kept food on the shelves of supermarkets, kept medicines, keeping our patients treated in hospital. And I think government needs to be thinking about these things, not just simply about balancing the books, but thinking about the long-term future.
Thank you very, very much. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I hope everyone will excuse us for doing a little bit of navel gazing, if that's okay, for you got us all on the call just for a few minutes just to talk about this. And we're all business representative organisations. Every day we're all looking at our turnovers, our membership, our commercial products, exactly how we can survive as organisations. We do a lot of lobbying work, which a lot of the people on the call are involved in at the moment. It's really hard to get commercial payback on some of that work. It's about for the common good sometimes. It's always difficult to justify that. But as organisations, I'm a very passionate believer in inclusivity, and unfortunately, we are just not inclusive enough as organisations, any of us, either through our membership or certainly our senior leadership. This call's no different. We're generally we are too white in our leadership and generally too male, you know, and that's a general sort of notice. How do we make our organisations more inclusive? And it's a really important thing. If we're going to be dynamic and more modern looking, how we address this is really important. Hannah, I'll come to you first if that's okay. Can we make our organisations more inclusive?
I hope so. I mean, you know, I think business representative organisations have never been more needed, but you know, business costs have never been under more strain. And it would be a shame that if at the end of all of this, you know, it's the line that comes out of the budget, because actually, you know, we work on behalf of all businesses, and we need businesses to continue to support all of us in order for us to do this work. We're a bit like an iceberg, all of us. You know, what you see in the media is the tip of the iceberg as to what we're actually doing in Whitehall and across local and regional governments to try and make things better for businesses. There's never been a more important time for us to be here, and we all need to be here in the years to come. But to do that, we need to stay relevant and we need to become more inclusive. I'm often the only woman in the room or the only woman on a panel, but I'm also conscious that I rarely share a platform with anyone who's not white. There's certainly an age demographic you sometimes find in some of the things that we do as well, and diversity of opinions, of voices, of experience is really important. I think you also see that when you look at the way that businesses are funded. You know, there's a real challenge around BAME, enterprise funding, women getting support to start up businesses. It goes right across the system. It's not just about our organisations. I think the most important thing to do is to look at the whole pipeline and the whole journey. So how can we encourage more people from diverse backgrounds to start up businesses, to get involved in business and in their communities? How do we make sure as organisations we have open and encourage people to come in? Sometimes you have to take proactive steps, and your neighbours in Greater Birmingham have got an Asian Chamber of Commerce to try and encourage more diversity within the chamber there. There are others who are setting up initiatives specifically around different groups. So taking really proactive steps and saying, this is a place where you are welcome and we want to hear about your experiences and we want to represent you. And then making sure you see that through in your governance and in your representation. Visibility really matters. And so making sure that on occasions like this, you have as much diversity as you can, and that the people you're bringing through to boards and other things, they need to represent the communities that you serve as well. So I hope that we can take steps, but we have to mindfully do that. We have to think about it. It won't happen by accident. It will have to be something we take proactive steps. But Callum will, CBI are taking a lead on some of this as well, but we're all thinking about it. We're all trying to do our best. We've now got a female Asian president of the Chambers of Commerce. Our chair is female. Claire and I are the first women on the executive team in 160 years. So there's some progress. We are all trying, and I know that you are as well, Corin, and your colleagues are around the Chamber network. But we've got a long way to go before we get it right.
Brilliant, thank you. And Mike, I know that the FSB take this very, very seriously as well, don't they?
We do, Corin, and I think it's fundamental to all of us remaining relevant to whatever business decides to do in which organisation they may wish to belong to. And we've always tried to make sure that as best we can, we are fully representative of the wider business community, and making sure that those underrepresented groups feel that there is some value in being able to be belong to FSB or Chamber or any other organisation. I think today, though, it's a very different environment for all of us compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago, where belonging to a membership organisation was something that you did as a business. And I think we all recognise that, and certainly FSB, we've been on this journey now for 2 or 3 years. COVID is accelerating that and making sure that we are very much representative of the wider business community, including any underrepresented group, and that includes right from the board down through the organisation at our regional levels and indeed throughout our staff levels. And I think, coming back to the point, we've had 2 predecessors of mine were female. Our chief exec has been female for the last 10, 12 years. And I think, we are very much cognizant that we need to continue that change and to make sure that we are relevant to the businesses that want to join us for whatever it may be, whether it be our lobbying, whether it be the offers that we have or anything else, just to offer that support mechanism, because by goodness, it's very, very lonely out there. If you're a self-employed person, a small business owner, you are alone, and people know that. So giving them that support is something that I hope that we are getting a lot better at, if not going to be relevant in the future. And I think that's the focus for the next 10 years. We have to maintain our relevance in the same way that our businesses have to be relevant to their customer base.
Thank you. And Callum, again, you've done a huge amount of work nationally and locally for this agenda, and it's a big issue for us all, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think all 4 of us actually in our organisations, the responsibility weighs heavily. We have got the ability to lead, and it's certainly something that we challenge ourselves on a lot, both as a business organisations group, but also internally as well, ourselves as businesses. The key things that we're really focusing on is what can we do in terms of changing our ways of working so that we become a little bit more inclusive. And that goes from not having breakfast meetings in terms of that could disproportionately prohibit some people from being able to come to a meeting because they're doing the school run, for instance, or just other little simple things like that. We really are challenging ourselves on it. And then Hannah also mentioned there in terms of our first BAME president, Lord Corin Crane, he's launched the Race to Work ratio, something that the CBI published earlier this month. Actually, it already seems like a long time ago, such as COVID's life. But really, that identified 4 steps for all businesses, irrespective of their size, in terms of whether or not they're international or local, SME, etc. They could take to be able to improve their diversity when it comes to race and ethnicity. And so those 4 steps are firstly, improving the diversity and inclusion element on your board. Secondly, in terms of your leadership team as well. So the 2 things often get conflated, but I think it's really important to distinguish between them. Then also in terms of being really transparent in terms of the actions that you're taking to be able to like deliver on those commitments. Hannah mentioned it there in terms of whether or not it's your annual report, whether or not it's just employee engagement. Lots of businesses, I think, like forget about the employee engagement piece. They just put it in their annual report and they think job done. So having that employee engagement piece is really important. And the final one, which I think all businesses can do, is having an inclusive culture so that people feel welcome, people feel like they belong, whether or not that's in terms of your members for a lot of us, or even if it's in terms of your staff as well and your supply chain at large. Those are the real things that I think all businesses can do so that we get better on this journey that we're all on.
Thank you. And Ben, the final word to you on this one is, I think inclusivity comes in your workforce, but also in supply chain sometimes, doesn't it, about how businesses do businesses together?
I mean, I think so. And I think there's a tremendous sort of appetite for this, incredible enthusiasm. And I go back to the point I made earlier about skills. Firms are incredibly aware that in order to compete and in order to address the skills problems and the deficits that they have, they need to work harder to go and bring in new talent. They need to go and look in places they haven't looked before. They need to talk to communities they haven't spoken to before. And I think we have great optimism that that's going to drive throughout firms and throughout the supply chain a real step change. What I would say about us as business groups, and I say this, I'm very conscious that of the 5 membership directors who were part of my team of direct reports, 4 of them are women. One of them, Charlotte, absolutely outstanding membership director, is here today. And I think we're very proud of that. We're very proud to have Dame Judith Hackett as our chair. But I think outside of our staff, the thing that we have to do more of, and I think we would all agree on this in terms of membership, and COVID has taught us this a little bit, I think, is that we need to go and talk to people outside of the groups that we already talk to. We need to do a lot more to spread the message about why our trade association is valuable. And I think, and I'm not just saying this to shoehorn yet another football reference in, but I was talking to someone at the Premier League a couple of weeks ago who said that actually there's a very interesting learning point for all sorts of membership bodies, not just trade associations, but membership bodies generally, that actually, if you look at the kind of people that went to football 20 years ago, it was a very specific type of person. And if you look at the kind of people that go to football today, or will be able to when grounds can open up again, there's been a real shift in the kind of people who go to football, because football clubs have reached out into their communities, whether at the Premier League level or whether the non-league level, to bring in to that club a representative group of people that actually make up the town, the city, the region that they're from. And I think cricket's done an excellent job as well. Rugby is on that journey too. So if we want to learn, and I talked earlier about humility, we may well have, Make UK's been around, next year will be our 125th anniversary. If we want to be here for another 125 years, we've got to work really hard to take out what we do, take our message and go and find people and explain why they should join. And I think that's really, really critical. Don't rely on people knowing about you. Make it comfortable for them to come and be part of your family.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. They were brilliant answers. From a very personal perspective, I'd consider myself a very vocal champion for inclusivity. And too often in this business festival, I've spotted things that I've been involved with that just haven't really hit the mark. So whatever we're all doing, we could all do better on this to simply make sure that what we're doing reflects the community around us in any way that is. And I'm going to set a very high bar for the festival next year to make it the most inclusive in the country, both for attendees and events. And I'm going to make sure I work with people who can help us do that properly. Because I think let's be exemplars. Let's constantly push the barriers for that. Wow, that's it. I've gone over. Sorry about that 6 minutes, but it was a really good debate. I do apologise. I owe you all about £600 each or something now for each minute I've done it. What a really cool debate. Thank you all so, so much. First of all, for the speakers for giving up your time tonight. I genuinely couldn't appreciate it more. Thank you very, very much. To the people who helped this, to Karen and to Charlotte, you just mentioned, and to Richard on the front line who helped make this a success tonight. I really, really appreciate that. And also to people who have tuned in. It's been brilliant. This is the penultimate day of the festival. You've all been brilliant. There's a whole packed day of events tomorrow, so don't give up just yet. Sign on, log into a few more. Make sure you turn up for them, because the dropouts are too high for some of these things. So don't give up on us. And at 4 o'clock is the final ceremony, when I'm going to weep into the screen, hopefully. Thank you so much, all of you. Enjoy your night, and united, we will get through this COVID crisis together. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Corin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and good night and keep safe.
Good night.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.
Thanks all.
Everyone. Cheers.
Take care.